Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Andrew Petersen, and I am the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. And welcome to this, the first edition of the ESG Quarter. As we gather, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the respective lands upon which we are all meeting from today, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of those lands. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and as well as emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples joining us today. Today kicks off a really interesting program that we're starting at BCSDA Australia for 2024, where we hope to bring to you a conversation about intertwining the principles of environmental, social, and governance with the core strategies of business that are aiming for not just profitability, but also that financial sustainability and resilience for future growth. The ESG Quarter is designed as a pivotal checkpoint for business to assess, and we think hopefully to understand and realign their operations within the ESG parameters that we're seeing increasingly becoming non-negotiable for long-term success. And what better way to do it, we thought, than to actually hold it in a quarterly format, just as business reports on financial progress in a quarterly fashion. So in our sessions, which will be held each quarter, we will be delving into the essential intersection of finance, legal, reporting, trade, as well as the overarching aspects of sustainable growth and inclusive sustainable growth for that matter, to explore how the factors of ESG are not merely ethical or strategic imperatives from a sustainability perspective, but are increasingly becoming key drivers of profitability or actually loss, and the economic resilience that we hope they bring in understanding what they mean to long-term financial success for business, and for that matter, for success of countries. The evolving landscape of sustainable business practices demands that the financial success and positive global impact go hand in hand. So on the screen, you will see a quick précis of what ESG is about, and for today, an outline of how we will be walking through this conversation. Let me turn that off and bring you back in so I can share it in this way. So let's start with Q4 of 2023, because as we're looking backwards, as you do in quarterly reviews, there were significant developments, and one particular that I'm sure Ilona and Karen will be eager to speak to, if not Tim and Murray for that matter, but I'll get to that in a minute, in this landscape that highlighted, I think, the interconnectedness of a number of areas that are coming through in key areas of data, insights, reports, publications and tools that have, I think, an important aspect to global efforts to address these pressing challenges. So here's my aggregated summary of the top 5 global developments in each of the areas of ESG. Now, the first probably comes as no surprise to anybody in the environment area, and that is the outcomes of COP28 and the Global Climate Summit held in Dubai in November, December. Its key outcomes included an acceptance of the global stocktake of both of national pledges, but also the realisation that action is moving, but not moving fast enough to reduce carbon emissions and the need for things like increased funding of climate action. But interestingly, during that quarter, we also saw some important release of information around global renewable energy expansion. So the International Energy Agency reported substantial investment in solar, in wind, in hydroelectric power projects. And all of these interesting developments show statistics on new renewable energy capacity that has been added globally just in 1 year. And it's quite significant. And I'm sure that particularly Tim will be talking about the profundity of what that sort of investment means to business growth, for that matter, and for economic stability across the world. We also saw the next phase of the plastic pollution treaty negotiations And whilst there was progress towards a global treaty, which was reported by the United Nations Environment Programme, it's important to note that while it's aiming to reduce single-use plastic production and enhance recycling efforts, there are many challenges that remain, particularly into 2024, as they begin to conclude what they hope to be an agreement by the end of this calendar year, so that they then move into the actions that will be taken as a result of the potential treaty that comes forward. Now, that's no mean feat, particularly from a timing perspective. In other developments on the area of deforestation rates in the Amazon, both NASA and the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research actually provided satellite data to show a significant reduction in deforestation rates right throughout the Amazon. Now, this is important because it happened as a result of strict enforcement of environmental laws. And that, I think, is something that we need to call out as we see progress and what are the actions and the enablers that create this progress in relation to momentum on ESG. And then finally, there was an enormous range of activities around green finance initiatives. The World Bank and independent and private financial market analysts reported the launch of a number of green finance initiatives, including green bonds, as well as sustainability-linked loans. We then moved to the social issues, and whilst they're not as well reported, they're just as profound, I think. The first was announcements on global health initiatives. The World Health Organization reported on the distribution of vaccines to lower income countries, aiming to reduce global health disparities. Now, that was something that was called out about 2-3 years ago during that thing that we remember to be COVID. And yet we're now only starting to see the success of that particular rollout. On the issue of education equity programs, UNESCO, one of the UN agencies, issued statistics that highlighted the increased access to education in underserved regions, demonstrating, we'd like to think, that efforts to close the education gap internationally are starting to happen. On the question of economic inequality reduction, the International Monetary Fund, as well as the World Bank, provided reports on the narrowing income disparities and poverty reduction measures that are starting to kick in. And now that's interesting and important because you're looking for lifting all boats into a decarbonised world. And how do you do that when there are clear economic disparities and, for that matter, income disparities right across our planet? On the question of social justice movements, and this is one I hadn't appreciated, but there was one of the highest records of media coverage throughout the last quarter of 2023, reporting increased participant estimates on social justice protests, advocating for issues like racial equality and gender rights. So key social inputs are occurring in key markets, in key economies, in key countries, right across the world around this dissatisfaction with the social equity paradigm. Moving on to governance, and whilst it might be a bit dry, it's interesting that a lot of them came out in Q4 in anticipation of what we see as the single most largest number of people voting on the planet ever in 2024. It's quite profound. It's so interesting to see and what that could mean for things like decarbonisation, let alone the ability of countries to effectively operate and collaborate with others going forward. So a quick précis of that. Anti-corruption measures. Transparency International reported on new anti-corruption laws that had been implemented in a number of countries to enhance transparency and accountability. We often hear the opposite, but in point of fact, there is several good news to hear around transparency. On the question of electoral reform, and obviously germane to this year's movement, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance provided data on those countries that have introduced electoral reforms to improve democratic processes. And pleasingly, they are there. Equally disturbingly, they're not as there as they would like to be in their, I suppose, their sheer number. On the question of public sector innovation, and this has actually come up in today's Australian Financial Review. So it's already been reported in the quarter before, but now we're starting to see it come into the financial and economic news press. The OECD showcased a number of innovative public sector projects that were aimed at improving governance and service delivery. I think we're going to see a lot more of this in 2024 is the government in Australia seeks to improve the transparency and ethical arrangements of the government, whether that's through the new National Anti-Corruption Commission, whether it's work in relation to the Global Open Partnership that BCSDA has been involved in, or it's work in relation to the dismantling and then the reformation of the Australian Administrative Tribunal into, and I've forgotten, I'm sure Ilona remembers what it's called, but it's going to be called something new. The UN, through the e-government survey, also made some interesting announcements around the adoption of digital governance solutions. So we are all talking about AI, but how do we ensure that it is equitable? How do we ensure that it is not harming individual privacy rights? There's some interesting insights that were given in the last quarter. So that's my context, and it's very high level and very global. But now let's dive into our speakers and their insights particularly. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce that our guest panel of speakers, who I think are at the forefront of the future of sustainable business practice, which is why I've asked them to join us today. That includes Murray Griffin, the founder and the CEO of Earthed.au, Tim Buckley, the founder and executive director of Climate Energy Finance, Ilona Millar, who I can't spell her surname correctly because it's AR, not ER, is the partner of Gilbert and Tobin and a legal mind in corporate governance to discuss the evolving legal frameworks and the importance of governance in safeguarding environmental and social responsibilities. And our very own Karen McWilliams is the sustainability and business reform leader at the Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand. Boy, you all get longer and longer titles as I introduce you. So thank you very much for joining us for what I hope will be an enlightening and inspiring session. Without further ado then, I want to welcome our first speaker, Murray, who's going to build on my opening and give you some observations from our very new reporting service, ESG Snapshot, particularly from the last quarter. So over to you, Murray. What have you been writing about and what have you been noticing are some of the trends over the last quarter on ESG?
Okay, well, thanks, Andrew, and greetings from Bunurong country. So I've been curating ESG Snapshot for BCSDA and its members for about 8 months now. And it's extraordinary to reflect on how much legislative and policy activity there's been in every jurisdiction over that time. And the amount of legislative activity on climate change, on energy and environment is enormous, and it far outstrips the amount of legislation introduced or passed on any other set of issues over that period. So currently, for example, there's a bill before Federal Parliament that deals with how the EPBC Act interacts with offshore infrastructure. There's an EPBC reform bill on the way, and consultation has just closed on draft climate-related financial disclosure legislation. There is a Queensland bill before the state parliament that deals with matters including emissions targets, and another bill in the Queensland Parliament that will make big changes to the state's environment law. There is a New South Wales bill that would ban seabed mining. There is an ACT bill that would insert the right to a healthy environment into the territory's human rights framework. There is a Victorian Renewable Energy and Storage Targets bill. There is a South Australian bill about carbon farming on pastoral land and a public comment process underway on biodiversity legislative reforms. There is a WA bill on climate targets, and the Northern Territory government, which goes to the polls in, I think, 6 months, is under pressure to introduce a biodiversity conservation law. So there's definitely a lot going on. And based on what I've noticed on and sort of reflected on as a result of having done ESG Snapshot since it started 8 months ago, there are several observations that I think are worth making. So firstly, with regard to climate-related financial disclosure, that will be a massive step forward. But I think there's a risk that some companies might just turn their sustainability managers into disclosure drudges, and that would be a double mistake. It would be a mistake, firstly, because good performing companies expect their sustainability managers to be strategic thinkers, not disclosure drones. And it would also be a mistake because preparing sustainability reports to comply with the upcoming climate disclosure legislation should be a task for the whole organisation, backed by strong management buy-in, because that's how your business will get the most out of the process. A second observation, and it's kind of related to the first point, is that boards are inevitably going to be heavily focused on climate disclosure for the next 12 months. But sustainability managers will have an important role to play in reminding them that disclosure isn't the only game in town. In particular, the issue of nature impacts and dependencies is rocketing up the charts in terms of business focus. And I would also add that circular economy developments is something that sustainability managers should keep a close eye on. Thirdly, it seems clear that it's now more important than ever before that companies be vocal supporters of strong, effective legislation and policies. For about 10 years or so, companies pretty much had the luxury of simply having to decide whether they were going to say something about a carbon price or whether they were going to have any input into what a national emissions target might be, because there was nothing else going on. But we now have an almost frenzied legislative agenda, which is what we need in order to catch up. And that makes it crucial that companies step up and give their support to good, strong laws and policies. That means joining progressive, ambitious organisations like BCSDA, and it also means ensuring that your other industry associations are actively supporting good laws and policies. Fourthly, one thing I've observed from ESG Snapshot is that companies do well when they make new friends. We track company news in ESG Snapshot, and it's crystal clear that leaders are finding ways to lead by forging new partnerships with sector peers, with neighbours, with think tanks, with startups, and with value chain partners. Fifthly, there's heaps of grant money around, and companies would do well to chase it. We track grant opportunities in ESG Snapshot, and I can tell you right now that you can get grants for hydrogen infrastructure or for natural capital projects or for high-tech recycling projects or for energy efficiency upgrades or even for, as of this week, the development of low-carbon packaging for premium Australian wine. So basically, if you haven't recently got some grant money or you're not well into the process of applying for some, then it might be worth thinking about whether you can try just a bit harder to get some funds to help you with your decarbonisation process. Lastly, it might seem like there's so much going on in Australia that no other economy could possibly be moving faster. But we track key international developments in ESG Snapshot, and the reality is many other countries are moving faster. The example I like to use is Singapore, even though it's a very different economy. Last year, Singapore had a carbon tax of $5. This year, it has a carbon tax of $24. It's busily signing so-called Article 6 agreements with many other countries for trading in high-integrity carbon credits. It's just signed an agreement with Indonesia to cooperate on CCS. And this month, it announced that from 2026, all flights leaving Singapore will have to have at least 1% sustainable aviation fuel, with a view to lifting the target to as much as 5% by 2030. And what that shows, I think, is that we can't put the brakes on what's happening domestically, even if we wanted to, because we would just lose out big time if we did. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks. Thanks, Murray. That was very comprehensive, and thank you for the plug for ESG Snapshot. Checks in the mail. Let's now ask our three leading commentators to give their reflections on a variety or a spectrum of issues. And coming up first, I would welcome Tim to take off his mute and share with us reflections, particularly of the last quarter, but probably the last quarter in the context of last year in relation to climate and energy news. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. And just building on what Andrew said, and Murray's comments about international competitiveness and international action on climate change, I'll also reference international connectedness and the financial implications for Australia. So firstly, Murray mentioned Singapore. I'll actually shout out China. We get a lot of negative press in Australia about China, but we are in the middle of a massive disruption of the global energy system. It is really well underway, and world-leading investments in the deployment of research and development, the deployment of renewable energy and manufacturing capacity. China absolutely leads the world. So let me just give you the comment. In 2023, the IEA reported that China invested $676 billion in clean tech, $676 billion, so over $1 trillion Aussie dollars in clean tech, in deployment, R&D and manufacturing. The US IRA has underpinned a step change in US investments, and America is moving faster than it's been moving in a decade on the back of President Biden's US Inflation Reduction Act. But China invested more than double what the US invested last year and more than double what the EU invested. So anyone that points at China still building new coal-fired power plants probably is only giving you a small part of the picture. They are number one in almost every zero emissions industry of the future. So that's my first key point. And as Murray said, the race is on. Australia needs to put our actions in the context of China probably doubling down on the back of the US IRA and going even faster. So the second point I'd make is about inflation and deflation. 2022 was a year of hyper inflation in fossil fuel prices because of Putin, globally and in Australia. 2023, we saw massive capex cost inflation and our mining industry, but it was also a global trend. We start 2024 with some other massive deflationary disruptions. So what I'm getting at there is in the last 2 years and in the next 2 years, China and the world as a result is doubling its capacity of battery manufacturing and solar manufacturing. China absolutely leads the world. They're doubling every 2 years and they're continuing to double over the next 2, 3, 4 years on any trajectory of or analysis of their planning. So we've seen the pricing. So my comment was about inflation versus deflation. The world's been smashed by hyperinflation from fossil fuels. We're now seeing deflation. So let me just mention what I'm talking about there. We have seen deflation in battery pricing. Prices have halved in the last 6 months, and they're forecast 6 to 12 months for batteries. We've seen solar module prices out of China halve in the last 3 to 6 months. And with that battery decline, we're seeing EV prices coming down double digits per annum. Now, you might want to put that in an Australian context. The nickel prices dropped 40, 50% in the last 6 to 12 months. The lithium prices dropped 80 to 90%. And we're the number one supplier of lithium in the world. 50% of the world's lithium comes from Australia, and lithium, obviously, and nickel go into batteries. So that's driving ongoing deflation. And I'm emphasizing the disruption that massive deflation means when you've got deflation of solar, batteries, and EVs. That's really turbocharging the energy transition, and it's driving the convergence of power, transport, and industry. I saw this morning Germany's top solar manufacturer has just announced that they're going to close their German module manufacturing operations. They've been one of the last German solar manufacturers still alive after the Chinese have smashed the industry globally. And they've just announced that because the EU's been really big on talk and really small on financial action, they're actually building their new module manufacturing facility in America and giving up on Europe. Even as the EU says they want to actually have domestic supply, they want China plus one, but the US has moved, whereas the EU, like Australia, has talked about moving. And so the US has a 40% import duty on Chinese modules. It's also got massive subsidies for US solar farms that use US produced solar modules. And that's all due to the IRA. So think about $1 trillion subsidy program from the US, and you could say goodbye to free markets when it comes to global energy systems and the auto systems and their manufacturing supply chains. So I'll come back to that point in a minute when Andrew gives me that nod to finish. But one really positive development domestically, and I'm not one to give Rio Tinto too many shouts out in positive in the last couple of years, but last week they announced a absolutely massive positive development. They're underwriting the world's or Southern Hemisphere's largest wind farm southwest of Gladstone. It's a 1.4 gigawatt wind farm being built by Twiggy Forest Wind Labs. And 2 weeks earlier, Rio announced a similar 25-year power purchase agreement. I'm emphasising the time because most Australian PPAs are 10 to 15 years. Both of these were 25 years, in other words, matching the duration of the wind and solar projects. So the solar project, 1.1 gigawatts near Gladstone, that means Rio now has the energy to drive decarbonisation of half of their alumina and aluminium refineries at Gladstone. So a massive step forward, $3 billion of investment, and Rio is driving decarbonisation consistent with their commitments to halve their global emissions by 2030. And by the way, aluminium supply chains are the majority of Rio's global emissions. I'll finish with the final point about nickel, or am I out? One more point? Yep. Okay, nickel. We've seen, I've just given China a big plug, but let's not underestimate when China is disrupting the world, they do it in self-interest, as every country does. So China's the #1 user of nickel in the world, 60% global share, 60%. China has been funding Indonesia to massively expand Indonesia's nickel business. Their market share has gone from 16% 6 years ago to 55% share in 2023. Why am I mentioning that? Because Australia was one of the top 2 or 3 suppliers of nickel, and now BHP has reported last week that they're losing $50 million a month in their nickel business in Australia, and that sparked crisis talks with the federal government. And the question I'm leaving you with, I want to leave you with, is how does Australia respond to the unstoppable growth of China in all of these zero emissions industries of the future, critical for solving the climate crisis, but China is flooding the world and they are very disruptive in that process. So the idea that Australia can leave it at the free market's not going to happen. The IRA is a $1 trillion subsidy. We did see a week ago Prime Minister Albanese talk about a uniquely Australian response to the IRA in May 2024. I'm calling for that because we need to actually rebuild Australian manufacturing and mining and compete fairly with China, but we've got to do it with our eyes open. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Tim. Well, you'll have to make sure you join us in the third quarter of the year to talk about that when we look at that quarter and that announcement. Speaking of announcements, Ilona, so much is going on in the legal world. It's just exhausting. And I'm not a practicing lawyer anymore, but you are. So give us your reflections on what the last quarter and dribbles into the first quarter of this year, because I feel like the last quarter just was, well, this quarter is just an extension of the last quarter now. What are you seeing without sharing client confidentiality? What are you experiencing they are coming to you and asking you about? And particularly riffing off either Murray or Tim, some of the observations, particularly in the energy space.
Yeah, so Andrew, it has been an insane 12 months of consultation, but in particular over the last sort of three to 6 months, we've just been responding to so many different consultation papers, both in terms of the implementation of newly passed legislation in the context of the safeguard mechanism, and sort of the discussions around how to actually now move from having the framework in the Green greenhouse and energy reporting scheme to the consultation on quite technical aspects of that implementation, in particular around setting of production the setting of the production variable emissions intensity criteria for particular activities, in particular focusing on the coal and the steel and iron making sectors as priorities. We've also been engaging around the approach to setting and determining international best practice benchmarks to apply to new facility entrants into the safeguard mechanism. And so I think the discussions there have been very engaging discussions with the department to develop those clear guiding frameworks for the sectors. But we're still in the very early stages of the first year of implementation of the reform safeguard mechanism, and I think there is going to be a lot more sort of for companies, and particularly those covered facilities, to engage with legally around the actual setting of their new baselines, and then also looking at what compliance means in practice. So whilst not a sort of regulatory policy development, one of the things that sits antecedent to the safeguard mechanism is the approach to sort of managing baseline exceedances and the ability to source ACCUs and potentially generate new safeguard mechanism credit units. And that's actually, that intersection has been one of the areas, just from a legal practitioner point of view, that we've seen quite a bit of activity as some of the large emitting facilities start to look at what their strategy is for sourcing credits for baseline exceedances over the next little while. Another related development in the context of that energy and policy sectoral consideration, and this sort of specifically links back to the safeguard mechanism and the energy intensive trade exposed facilities, is the government's commitment to engage with addressing carbon leakage and considering things like a possible carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so we've just had the consultation process for the first round of submissions on the carbon leakage review. That sort of is asking a number of questions around policy design for looking at what impacts will be on trade exposed sectors as a result of the introduction of not just the safeguard mechanism, but also the other policy mechanisms that Australia is considering and introducing to implement its nationally determined contribution and its 2030 and future climate change commitments and targets. I think the initial process of consultation has been quite broad-ranging and high-level, but what we'll be looking at getting into the real detail about later in the year will be the actual design of a possible carbon border adjustment mechanism for Australia, and how that then sits with the existing flexibility given to those trade exposed companies under the safeguard mechanism will be an interesting sort of point that fits within the discussion around the ongoing implementation of the safeguard mechanism as well. So in that, what's been interesting, I think, this year is that the government has signalled and is taking a sectoral approach to its energy and emissions policy. We've seen that with safeguards for industrial and other sort of large resources sectors. With energy, the commitment to an 82% renewable energy target by 2030. That has and Tim, I'm sure, will have some commentary on this, but it's been interesting to see how that has played out, because notwithstanding the target, the development of the necessary capacity to achieve it has been very, very slow and subject to a number of hurdles, not least of which has been sort of red tape around approvals and permitting, but also issues around sort of the landscape for finance in that space. And what was interesting seeing at the end of last year, and this sort of sits in parallel with some of the decisions coming out of COP28 and the commitments to achieve global renewable energy deployment, was the Australian government sort of signalling its intention to provide a capacity investment scheme to support investment into Australian renewables. And so whilst we don't know how much is going to go into that in terms of a dollar amount, there is going to be a significant, a new framework for companies to bid in to this capacity investment scheme to be able to scale up the deployment of renewable energy. And also part of the commitment there from the government was to address some of those sort of approval and regulatory barriers for projects. So again, a lot happening in the energy space. Also taking that sectoral approach, we saw just in the last few weeks the announcement of a policy paper to deal with the new vehicle efficiency standards. That has had certainly a lot of press in terms of the potential negative impacts on certain participants in the sector, but it's only bringing Australia, as a very slow follower, closer to where we see vehicle emission standards in the US, in Europe. Even Canada recently released new vehicle standards for light vehicles with an aim to achieve, full deployment of electric vehicles over the coming sort of period. So a lot is happening in the energy and climate space from a regulatory perspective. The other two areas where there is significant regulatory change is in disclosure and then also in nature. I might start with nature and then come back to disclosure because I think that's probably where Karen's going to pick up. So with nature, we saw quite surprisingly at the end of last year the passage of the Nature Repair Act, no longer a Nature Repair Market Act. But the legislation is largely in the form that was consulted on towards the end of last year, and which was actually subject to a Senate inquiry, which didn't actually get to finish before the passage of the bill. But in any event, what we now have is a legislative framework not that dissimilar to the framework that applies for the development of carbon credits under the carbon farming legislation, which will enable landholders to voluntarily design and develop project activities which will deliver nature positive outcomes and to obtain a single instrument or certificate for achieving those nature positive outcomes, which will then be a tradable instrument and that can be then evidence the contribution to nature restoration and repair. A really controversial aspect of the legislation was whether or not it would allow these certificates to be used for offsets in other state or federal offsetting approaches. And one of the key changes to the legislation before it passed, sort of coming through with amendments from some of the independents, was to remove any ability for these new certificates to be able to use as offsets. So they have to actually demonstrate a positive contribution. And this is then sort of legislation which is intended to give effect to Australia's commitments under the biodiversity framework, which was agreed at the biodiversity COP back in at the end of 2022. Australia is very committed to engaging with the creation of new nature markets and the opportunity to incentivise both private sector investment into nature. And indeed, the government will be holding a international conference on that in October. Just before the bill sort of was debated and passed, one of the important sort of legal developments that we had last year back in October was the release of an opinion by Sebastian Hartford-Davies and Zoe Bush on directors' duties in respect of nature-related financial disclosures. So throughout last year, we also had the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures finalising its first iteration of its recommendations for the TNFD, building on the TCFD. From that, we also have had a legal opinion that in the same way that the earlier Hutley and Hartford-Davies opinions on climate-related financial disclosures highlighted that significant sort of issue of the importance of considering directors' duties in the context of any statements related to climate-related financial disclosures. We now have an opinion from very well-respected legal practitioners that where there are nature-related financial risks and opportunities, including impacts and dependencies, these may constitute material issues and risks that directors acting in accordance with their duty of care and diligence ought take into consideration. We don't have a formal regime in respect of disclosure obligations for nature, but if the nature-related risks do pose a material financial risk, it is incumbent on directors to be considering them. So it's putting that issue fairly on the table for boards in this space. And then I guess the area that has been most hectic in terms of consultation over the last 3 months has been the release at the beginning of this year of the proposed amendments to the Corporations Law and to the ASIC Act to introduce mandatory, no longer climate, we're now talking about sustainability-related financial disclosures. And so what the draft bill does is introduce new reporting obligations for companies to provide a sustainability report, which will be linked to criteria that are set by the Australian Accounting Standards Board. And in parallel, we've had the work being done by the ASSB to translate the sustainability and climate-related financial standards that have been developed by the International Sustainability Standards Board into Australian standards, which are currently also in consultation in draft form. And what we will see through the introduction of these new amendments to the Corporations Law and ASIC Act, once they're finalised, is a new reporting obligation to prepare these reports and to do so in accordance with those standards, in the first instance focusing on the climate-related financial disclosures. One of the key elements from a legal perspective in terms of the legislation is firstly the approach to coverage. And people may recall last year, as part of the consultation process on the design of these reporting obligations, the government has proposed a series of different groups as reporting entities, and will be phasing in the introduction of reporting obligations based on the size and scale of an organisation, and also whether it's reporting under the greenhouse and energy reporting laws and having publication obligations under those to date. A key aspect of the phasing in, one of the questions raised was the proposal is for that first cohort of large organisations to kick off reporting from the financial year commencing 1 July 2024. There was a question in the consultation about whether that should be delayed for 6 months, just because it is quite a task to start to pull together all the information that's likely to be required for reporting. Noting that reporting will there will be the proposal is that while Scope 3 is covered by the reporting framework, that won't be required until the second year of reporting. And also sort of noting from a legal perspective that there are proposals to provide a modified liability regime for the first couple of years of the scheme to enable sort of smoother transition into reporting without punitive sanctions for non-compliances. I'm conscious of time, so I'll sort of stop there because I know Karen probably has a lot more to say about the engagement and consultation around mandatory disclosure.
Well, that was a perfect moment to pick up the parcel on climate risk reporting and hand it over to Karen, particularly as a number of us in this space have always wanted the financial apparatus to be involved in this conversation, and very excited and very pleased, particularly that we have Karen from the Chartered Accountants Australia, New Zealand, to be joining us today to talk about that. Karen, share with us your last 3, 4, 5 months and how you've been able to actually function as a result of both your members, but also the engagement that the CAANZ provides to a number of us as peak bodies in relation to what's coming down the line in consultation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Andrew. And I guess it sort of flows on what I was going to say. It flows on very, very well from, I guess, Murray, Tim and Ilona's comments. So Ilona mentioned, obviously, Treasury, they've done their exposure draft consultation, and they've also set out their very clear policy position on what they think are the policy pieces. It has created some confusion, I think, because Treasury's policy position touches on aspects of what might be in the standards versus what's in the legislation. So we've got a little bit of a blurring of the lines that we're starting to see between policy and standard setting. But regardless of all of that, we've also seen, I guess, the standards from the Australian Accounting Standards Board, the AASB, be released for consultation. They came out before Treasury's policy position was released in final, which means there are some things in those standards that doesn't necessarily align with Treasury's policy position. So there are a little bits of, I guess, making sure the legislation and the standards do ultimately align. And as Ilona indicated, in theory, if we do have a 1 July application start date, there's a lot to be done prior to that to get things moving. So the Australian Accounting Standards Board, the AASB, they have a consultation out at the moment that closes this Friday, so you still have a chance to provide feedback on those standards. They have a few final face-to-face sessions as well in Sydney and Melbourne, I think, this week, and there's survey options, so you can give feedback. You can only give feedback on one question if you want, so you don't need to respond to everything. It is important, I think, that they hear from as many stakeholders as possible what they think of the standards. They've based their standards on the international standards, so the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, S1, the General Disclosure Requirements for Sustainability-Related Financial Information, and S2, Climate-Related Disclosures. So that is the basis for the standards. As Ilona indicated, they are only applying to climate disclosures in this case, and the AASB have, I guess, adapted the international standards and modified them to limit IFRS S1 to only apply to climate disclosures, and then they've removed any duplicated content from IFRS S2. So this does simplify the standards, and they're called now ASRSs. Does make them easier to apply, I guess, for climate disclosures, but does reduce that international alignment because they now look very different from the ISSB standards, and also means that probably ASRS 1 would probably need amending in the future if the disclosures go beyond climate. As Ilona has signalled, Treasury's sort of draft legislation positions everything as a sustainability report with a climate statement in it, which kind of gives the impression, along with their sustainable finance consultation last year, that there are intentions to probably extend sustainability reporting beyond climate. And also companies may wish to do so in a voluntary sense as well. So at the moment, that's where sort of, I guess, S1 in the Australian context looks a bit different to the global one. Other key, I guess, changes from the ISSB standards are that they've changed the industry metrics. They were mandatory, they're now voluntary, and they don't reference the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board guidance. They've asked you to do greenhouse gas emissions measurement using NGAs, unless it's not practical to do so, and only then look at the greenhouse gas protocol, whereas the ISSB pretty much goes with the ISSB, with the greenhouse gas protocol, sorry. Of the two scenarios that you're to use, the AASB has specified that one should be aligned with the Climate Change Act's lower temperature goal, and one a high temperature scenario that's unspecified. Now, 2 scenarios is in line with the ISSB standards, so really they're following Treasury's request that one be aligned to the Climate Change Act. And just another sort of differential is in Scope 3 emissions. you need to disclose Scope 3 emissions, but the AASB are suggesting that maybe you don't have to disclose them in line with the 15 categories in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The AASB have also included some sector neutral requirements where they have deemed those necessary because their standards are sector neutral. So those are really additives, and it is something that takes place in the Accounting Standards 1 as well. So certainly there are, it is quite a meaty draft to have a look at. It does bring to life the TCFD, and actually, as I said, the deviations are fairly limited from the ISSB, but there are some key ones to consider, particularly for organisations who are concerned around international alignment. Certainly, the advice is that all groups of entities, whether you're Group 1 or Group 3, you need to start getting ready now, because even if you're in Group 2 or Group 3, you might think you've got a bit more time, but you are going to need that time to prepare. So certainly, we've been very clear to everyone, you need to start looking at these standards now and get ready. And capacity building is going to be quite important. And I think, as Murray indicated earlier, around how actually these disclosures are going to come to effect, we certainly see and expect to see more of close collaboration between sustainability teams and finance teams in order to bring to light these disclosures, along with risk teams and legal and a number of others. It's going to be a very collaborative approach, and will need to be. Just a few other reflections, I guess, globally. Officially at COP28, the TCFD was officially disbanded, and it's been basically wrapped up into the ISSB because their standards now fully incorporate the TCFD recommendations, and they're going to be responsible for monitoring that ongoing. The ISSB themselves, they're pretty focused on capacity building and helping jurisdictions adopt the ISSB standards, i.e. Australia and others. Brazil and Turkey have recently announced their commitments to incorporate ISSB standards, and during COP they also launched the IFRS Sustainability Knowledge Hub, so that's got a whole heap of resources from the IFRS Foundation and other partner organisations, so that's a great source of information on the standards and getting started. The ISSB, we're still waiting for them to really determine what they're going to do following their 2023 consultation on their future work plan. They've had a number of meetings to discuss the feedback around this, but I'm still not really seeing any clear direction of which of those 4 options that were presented they're going to take forward. At their last meeting, which was only last week, they discussed the development of education material on materiality and the criteria in order to prioritise the future projects. So they were discussing the criteria. They still aren't actually nutted out what those projects are. I guess there's other kind of key things happening. GRI, they've published some guidance on how you can do greenhouse gas emissions reporting between GRI and ISSB. And they've also done draft similar ones with the European ESRSs. So we're seeing quite a bit of shift with all of these different reporting frameworks to really start to show how they align and how they're interoperable. You can report in line with one, but meet requirements of the other with very minimal tweaks. So that's been a real push, I guess, globally from a number of those standard setters. The GRI are just about to finish their consultation this week on their new climate change and energy exposure drafts. So if you didn't feel you'd had enough consultations, there's that one as well. Likewise, the International Ethical Standards Board for Accountants, they have just released their latest amendments to the Code of Ethics for Sustainability Assurance Practitioners, but these will apply to sustainability assurance practitioners, both accounting profession, but also outside of the accounting profession. So they will have a wider applicability, and that is intentional, noting that not those who do sustainability assurance may not all be accountants. The other sort of thing I guess it's interesting to me is we're going to see New Zealand's first climate statements coming out soon. So their standards, TCFD aligned, apply to about 200 of the largest listed entities and financial institutions. They kicked off for the 23 calendar year as the first thing from 1 January last year. So we will start to see those first statements come through following December year end. There are mostly March and June year ends in New Zealand, so we will still be a few months away from seeing some of the major disclosures coming out from main entities, but there will be a few dribbling through, I think, following the December. I think Ilona touched on most of the things I was going to mention around nature, but the TNFD are currently got consultations out as well on sectors with high impacts and high dependencies. So they've got 8 guides that they've done for those key sectors, and also financial institutions around scenario analysis and biodiversity footprinting approaches. The other things I just wanted to mention briefly is as one consultation closes with the AASB closing this week. another opens, and we can expect the ASX Corporate Governance Council to release their consultation draft of the 5th edition this week. They announced in December that it was intended to be published in February 24, which hopefully means this week. So keep a lookout for that one. Yeah, that I think is intended to sort of look at, I guess, how the governance principles can be updated to reflect current governance practices. So that's going to be quite important, and obviously important to get wide-ranging feedback on those key changes. So that was probably the main things for me. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Karen. So as apparently the market is flat today, in total contrast, the non-financial activity is absolutely stratospheric. Is that the word? It's just going absolutely crazy. So, and we've already, I think, created the reason for being for the next ESG quarter, thanks to all the insights you gave. We don't actually have any time, I don't think, to go through a round of questions, but I did want to just quickly get a sense check for the benefit of our audience around this question. It is very much not business is up to it, because business has responded and in a number of quarters has been leading the charge. But do you, or have you seen, or have you had feedback around this notion of it needs to slow down a bit because we can't digest it as a business? Read a very interesting insight from Ross Gittins during the week that said businesses historically operated on the model, particularly in Australia, of scale and efficiency. That's all been blown up. Not so much because of the ESG narrative, but because COVID required a new approach, which required, in some cases, a lot more innovation, both social, technical, and operational. But as we move into responding quite aggressively in this momentum on decarbonisation and now also nature, and I think also responding to the Plastics Pollution Treaty coming forward, do you get a sense, are you hearing that business is saying, please, please, can we just slow down a little, because we can't actually digest this into our current operations, and or our strategic direction requires a lot more thinking before we know how to respond to this? And I'll do it backwards, and then we'll sign off with Murray being the last commentator. So Karen first.
Look, I think it is a valid concern. I think those of us who are active in this space are struggling to keep on top of it, and therefore if you're trying to run a business and do that, there's a lot to get your head around. I think the reality is, though, it's not going to slow down, and there needs to be ways of getting on top of it, and I think also ways of seeing it and bring it in as part of just doing business. And I think it's trying to not see these things as separate pieces. The E, S and the G are not separate things, they are just how you operate and how you bring it in. But there's no doubt it's challenging, and that's why updates like this are going to be incredibly important to stay across what's going on in this space, and help businesses, I guess, be proactive. And the collaboration, like we said, you need to work with multiple teams, and not try to do this on your own. Make it an organisation-wide issue. This is not something that's just defined in just the role of the sustainability team on its own.
Yeah, thanks. And for business, it's never been more true than to tap into your existing service providers like lawyers and accountants and consultants, because they are publishing a shed load of serious and important and I think deep insights that business can avail themselves, as well as collaborations like the work of Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand in the peak body consultation on both the the climate risk disclosure legislation, and also the AASB consultation. That has been incredibly beneficial to us at BCSD Australia. Ilona.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with Karen. I think it's a huge challenge for corporates to get on top of this. And I think Tim's just posted in the chat a link to the article to the BCA saying we need another 12 months. But the reality is, we are seeing a movement globally towards the introduction of mandatory disclosure obligations. Australia is not the first cab off the rank doing this, and so I think we do need to some extent just get on and start doing it. And in that respect, you know, it will be challenging, but a lot of the companies that will be in the first cohort of reporting entities are already capturing a lot of this information. They've been reporting consistent with TCFD, and they've been, you know, producing and publishing various forms of sustainability reports. You know, it's certainly not everyone that's captured by that first cohort, but you know, I think the bigger lift is going to be for the Group 2 and Group 3 entities. So yeah, my sense is it is going to be very, very challenging, but you know, I think the government sort of recognition of that is to try and sort of provide a framework in which it will take people along on a process and a journey with an enforcement focus on education in the first instance before moving towards those punitive approaches as well.
Thanks. Tim?
Yeah, I accept that there's a lot happening. I like the staggered introduction. Let's let the big guys go first, and that can build some capacity. We learn by doing. I will say the climate science has been known for more than 40 years. And so having procrastinated, having chucked out a good solution a decade ago, we now have to catch up. The climate science isn't going to wait while we delay. It's only in the fossil fuel interest. So my view is we need to push through it and don't let perfection get in the way of roughly correct. And that's why I like the fact that Treasury is saying activists like me can't sue directors for the first 3 years. It's actually got to be a genuine attempt, but you're not going to get it right first year. Let's do our best. We need to.
Thank you. And final word to Murray.
Thanks, Andrew. I guess my advice to anybody who thinks it's all happening too quickly would be to hop in a time machine, go back 10 years and lobby really hard for the retention of the carbon price. That's why we're in the situation we're in today. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. And the phrase, the critical decade, it's not just a sort of glib statement. I mean, we have so much to do and achieve in this decade that we really have no choice. And yeah, I understand that it's really hard because in some ways it's not, you know, the phrase transition can seem almost comforting. It's really a bit like a reinvention for so many companies, but it's still, it just has to be done, and it has to be done quickly.
Yeah, I totally agree. Two thoughts come to mind. The first is Geraldine Granger from Vicar of Dibley saying, crack on. But the other is, and this is how I explained it to colleagues in my sphere, which is, so if you were diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer and you were told that radiation and a number of other therapies were available to you, but you had to start now if you wanted to get on top of it, would you actually say, oh, could we wait a year while I sort of find out if it's going to be any worse? I don't follow that logic. So with that, and a slight downer at the end of this, but thank you so much for the contribution in drawing this first ESG quarter to an end. Can I extend my deep gratitude to our distinguished speakers, Murray Griffin, Tim Buckley, Ilona, I can't spell her surname, Millar, and Karen McWilliams. A big thank you. I have asked them if they're willing to do this for the rest of the calendar year, and I didn't get a no. So look forward to the next announcement. I think it's the 8th of April. To our audience particularly, thank you for dialing in and hanging in there in most part, and for bringing the engaging questions that you have. We will actually respond to them in kind back through LinkedIn and or at the next conversation. So if you want to hear your response, by all means, join us then. I'm pleased to announce that today's recording of the program will be available on our YouTube channel next week. However, for a first look of this, the recording will actually appear in next Monday's edition of ESG Snapshot, which will be sent out to members on Monday morning. And if you're not a member and you'd like to get the free 6-week trial, you can do so. I encourage you to do so by visiting our website. You can sign up through there to get it. It's a fantastic opportunity to stay informed and connected through the information that is created by, not me, Mr. Griffin, in a very comprehensive and erudite way every single Monday. Mark your calendars if you haven't already for the next ESG snapshot, as I said, which is the ESG quarter, which is the 8th of April. And we promise another session filled with meaningful discussion and expert perspective on the evolving landscape of the sustainable business practice in Australia. Thank you so much for your feedback. If you do have any directly, at bcsda.org.au is very much welcome. And until then, thank you once again for joining us today. Your engagement and your interest has been much valued, as we think it's important to discuss on a very regular basis the opportunities fostering this sustainable future for what are driving us all forward. We look forward to welcoming you on the next occasion. Bye for now.